back to our third video in this kind of training principles review slash kind of unpacking series thing that we got going on. So last time we covered overload, which was the second most important thing to do with training. Just a brief revisit. Overload meaning that your training generally has to get harder over time. Again, not immediately, but it does have to get up. It can't just cruise along at the same kind of pace. It needs to be challenging. It needs to be stressful in order to elicit the adaptation, which is the training effect that you're usually looking for. And before that, we looked at specificity, which is essentially the guiding principle behind all of your training, and just making sure that you always have direction in your training with regards to what you want to achieve with it. So this time, part 3, dealing with triple trouble, we are going to look at fatigue management. So fatigue management, funnily enough, is the management of fatigue. What is fatigue? Essentially stress, or stress accumulation on you, your body, the system that is you. So most people will, if they have lifted weights ever before, have a very clear example of training stress in DOMs, that kind of soreness you get after a heavy session, not even a heavy session, just after most sessions, you will feel some kind of soreness if you actually did anything at all, and we'll get into why that's important in a bit. So one thing that we definitely have to define first before we go into all this is we are talking purely from a training fatigue. God damn, my finger really looks fucked up from this camera angle. That's hilarious. We are talking about training fatigue, not injury fatigue. Recovery from training, not recovery from injury. So a lot of literature and stuff that people commonly associate with recovery is mostly to do with injury recovery stuff. So stuff like foam rolling, physio, massage, compassionate touching, as it's, I think that's the umbrella term. Heat, ice, compression, all that kind of stuff. The bulk of stuff is in reference to injury recovery. Some of it is applicable contextually to training recovery as well, but a lot of the good stuff about it is mostly due to injury, and that's an entirely different topic. This is literally just about training. So last time when we talked briefly on some kind of volume landmark terms, your max recoverable volume being like the most training you can do and still repeat or increase training next week, essentially, like the most training you can survive. And your minimum adaptive volume, the least you need to do to get better, like your C+, like scraping grade of training volume. So when we're talking about training fatigue, we mean in relation to that. How do we recover, or make sure we recover to train again? So big ones for that, a lot of people probably know already. Eating, consuming calories. We talked about how, I think we might have touched on how MRV can be affected by caloric intake. If we haven't, essentially, if you are in a calorie deficit, if you're trying to adjust body composition or cut weight, your maximum potential volume that you can handle will obviously decrease because you do not have the kind of surplus of nutrients, specifically carbohydrates a lot of the time, that would let you kind of really push the bounds of what is possible in terms of volume training for you. Whereas if you are in a calorie surplus, if you're trying to gain muscle, if you're trying to win the hypertrophy, then you can definitely push way farther. One other thing to note is that if you're in a calorie surplus as well, your minimum adaptive volume will probably go up. So the minimum you need to get any kind of stress when you're in a kind of hypocaloric state, you're in an abundance of calories, and you're doing other things like sleeping that we'll talk about. Essentially, your goalposts will kind of shift up a bit and a little bit closer together. Whereas when you're cutting, your end goalpost of MRV will shift down, and this one might shift down a little bit, but will probably stay about the same as usual. The other big one is sleeping, of course. Everybody does that. You definitely need to get 6 to 7 if you are kind of like a hobby athlete, as in you are not trying to be utmost optimal. It can also vary depending on how large of a human you are. and how qualified, so how much damage you can completely accrue with your training, as in, like, the stronger you get, the more damage you can accrue just by pure weight usage. Again, somebody doing 5x5 at 100 and somebody doing 5x5 at 200 are completely different beasts. It's literally double the actual physical work shifted. Also, bigger people, if you shift the same weight from 6 foot high down to 3 feet at the bottom of a squat, rather than like 5 feet to 3 feet at the bottom of a squat, you are literally moving the weight a bigger distance and will accrue more work in that kind of very physics sense. So bigger people, again, generally take a bit longer to recover, so if you go to one end of the spectrum, your very petite female athletes will recover very quickly, whereas your extremely super heavy dudes, like 120 plus type guys, if they're sitting at like 130 kilos or something like that, will take the longest to recover. And then everyone else kind of bats around in the middle, and you've just got to figure it out based on individual temperaments and how much they can kind of get done recovery-wise, which is what we're talking about, fatigue management. So, eating, sleeping, big deals. Specifically, if you have any super heavy male clients, or particularly heavy clients in general of either gender, however more common with dudes, it may be something you want to look into in terms of if they have any sleep apnea. Again, that can affect recovery dramatically. Essentially, you're just not getting almost any REM sleep. They could like easily plow 8 hours sleep and wake up feeling like shit. Wake up multiple times, they just go to bed tired, they wake up tired. That kind of stuff can definitely happen. It's something to consider. Maybe not if you're not super into competing at like an absolute top level. You might just again have to deal with it, or if realistically just cut and not be so fucking fat. But even it's not even a fat related thing, it's just like a general weight thing. So as your body weight increases, the general like weight and mass of your neck tissue will increase to the point where if you try sleep it can compress your airways and you end up snoring like my dog. Like one of those guys up there. Anyway, the other big thing that is really good to take into consideration is just relaxation time. So that's kind of like your chill out time. So kind of almost like sleeping but in the day. So you take some time to totally chill out. You do nothing, like sit on the couch, binge on Netflix, play video games, read, listen to audiobooks, whatever you want to do, but just do very little. Essentially become as sedentary as possible and as relaxed as possible. Again, some people like to build this generally into their nighttime routine because it's quite difficult to do in the middle of the day because you obviously have to get up and work at some other point as well. So you kind of peak. So you kind of get up, go to work, get stressed out at work, blah 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 blah, and then you have to, it's best to do just when you come home and know that you aren't going to have to do anything else, and then you can just kind of kick back and relax a bunch. That's extremely helpful for recovery. The other thing that is extremely helpful for managing fatigue is making sure to manage emotional mental stressors. So how much mental stress you kind of assign to random day-to-day shit. So if you if you spend your morning getting really pissed off at articles about millennials eating Tide Pods or something and actually let it negatively impact your emotion to the point when you're just like, fucking dumbasses, why are you eating laundry detergent? Like, that kind of stuff will add up and will add on to your total stress. Again, a fairly reasonable analogy for this entire process is if you have a bucket under a tap and you have an outlet valve on the bucket. You essentially, your fatigue management strategies are the aperture of the bucket, of the drain thing on the bottom of the bucket. Like, you can either, if you have absolutely no outlet and you're piling stress into that with training, work, training stress, work stress, like everything all goes in. Your body doesn't differentiate between different types of stress. Like, it doesn't realize that you, like, sweating it out and, like, being all tensed up about bills being kind of, like, ropey this month, not sure if you can pay them, and lifting weights, they don't differentiate by the fact that you kind of want to lift weights. It just all goes into the same bucket. And if your outlet valve is minimal or not very well open at all, it will not take long for that bucket to fill up and your stress to just accumulate. And the funny thing about the bucket analogy, the only time you will notice or that something bad will happen from too much stress is when it's too fucking late, because the water will flow out of the bucket and then hit the floor, in this metaphor. However, when it hits the floor is when you essentially run into something called a lagging fatigue indicator, which is like, you get injured, or you are extremely beat up and just mentally give out on training. Like, there will be a point. Either you will just ignore absolutely every warning sign that your body is throwing at you, case in point, myself, and just keep plowing ahead, calling yourself a pussy, calling yourself a bitch, and blah 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 blah, deloads are for the weak. Plow ahead, and then you'll just get injured. Like, there will be something, there will be a breaking point. Nobody, if you can train indefinitely without any with any deloads, you might call them something else, but essentially any periods of distinctly lower volume, you will lose. Like, biology wins. Like, life finds a way, and it will fuck you. You will either get sick through various, I imagine, immune suppressant responses to, like, excessive stress, or you'll fucking injure yourself. Something will happen. If you can train indefinitely, you're not really training that fucking hard. Like, everybody could deload and do fuck all forever. That's really easy. However, if you're actually trying to push yourself, like we talked about, overload, and trying to make sure that your training gets generally harder over time, there will be a limit to how much you can push before you have to actually have a look and be like, oh, there are warning signs flaring up, like, I feel really beat up, like, my joints hurt, like, you get that weird, like, pain under your thumbnails, like, when you get ill and all your joints hurt, even your fingers and, like, your elbows and wrists and weird shit like that, like, your toes hurt. That kind of stuff will flare up long before, well, hopefully long before stuff starts to really go Pete Tong, and you should pay attention. If it happens for more than one day in a row, so it's not just like, oh, I had crunch time at work, so I had to stay up late last night, and then that's why I feel like shit today, and even then, if you feel like shit today, fatigue management strategy, you can take an active rest day. Like, chill your training down for that day if you train at all. I would advise you train, but just go in, do your warm-up, cut stuff by like 50%, on intensity, or sorry, on volume, and then maybe like 20% less intensity, 10% less intensity is probably fine. Cut it by a bit, and just do very little, but still do stuff, so you get your practice in, you get your squats in, get your bench in, whatever else you're doing, just cut the work. Like, really don't think you can push the envelope like that, and then you've accumulated like a little step forward, and not fucked yourself. If you pitch up the next day, and you wake up and everything's still miserable and you want to senpuku yourself, then it's time to have a look at your fatigue management again, cause have you actually been sleeping as well as you thought? Have you been eating as well as you thought? Or has crunch time at work completely screwed that up as well? If you have, it might be some time to just take an impromptu deload week until stuff at work, in this scenario anyway, chills out and allows you to really kind of push the envelope in terms of training volume again. Paying the bills is number one. Like, powerlifting will never ever fucking pay your bills. I don't care what people say, there are no professional powerlifters. Nobody goes to a building society and or bank and is like, herp a derp, here's my powerlifting watch records, please give me a house. They'll be like, no. Like, even in most countries, if you're a fucking Olympian, they're not going to be like, oh yeah, sure, have a house. No. You need to do your fucking job and pay your bills to keep a roof over your head and keep food on the table, and then you can worry about lifting weights and doing other shit. Like, there will always be time to lift more weights. Like, you're not going to piss away all your strength by taking a week, not even off, literally just talking about taking a week at that, like, minimum volume you need to do to not get worse. Remember? Not get worse? So you literally should have a net neutral effect on training. So you can just coast for a little bit, and then come back at it when you've got the resources and, like, I don't know, life memory to, like, allow for so much usage. So, what other stuff could be contextually useful? not a lot of them in powerlifting. We talked about on peaking briefly. If you are in your peak week, ready for competition, some of the methods that are usually done for injury, so stuff like sauna, like kind of short-term heat exposure stuff, massage, deep tissue, Graston, gua sha, acupuncture, heroin, or maybe not heroin, that kind of stuff becomes useful because you are trying to feel as confident as possible, as well as clear fatigue. So as long as stuff isn't going to net decrease performance, as in like in the same way training does, so like you put stress on and then lower training potential because you have to reacclimate to new stress. If you can avoid putting stress on your body whilst dropping fatigue, essentially what you want to do in a peak, you want to kind of like take all this new training effect you've got and ditch the fatigue so that it can hopefully peak up a little bit, and also your ability to perform outside the presence of fatigue is much better than your ability to perform in the presence of fatigue. And so anything that can help you with that is really good. So again, compassionate touching stuff, all that becomes way applicable. Outside of powerlifting, it's a bit more applicable, especially in competitive sports, because you've got the aspect of that is your goal, is to play the sport. So if it's a choice between ice compression and a massage, as much as it might not help recover from training, if it's going to put you back in the game next week or on the weekend because you're a bit beat up from the game before, that's 100% something you should do. Essentially, especially if you're in mid-season with competitive athletes, depending on how long the season is, keeping yourself able to play at the level you're playing at through whatever you want is very much an applicable solution. Normally, for training, you want to make sure you're just recovering properly without having to kind of circumnavigate it with things that are just there to kind of like slap a plaster on feeling shit. They're just essentially trying to make you feel like you can play again, or that, you know, some of them will reduce, again, this is related to injury. So joint pain, all this kind of stuff isn't training fatigue. That's just short-term injury or like warning signs of injury. If you're trying to like slap a band-aid on that with like ice compression, heat, all that kind of stuff, fine. Because your goal is to ultimately play in your competitive sport. And again, use your best judgment. If the season is just beginning and you have problems like that, it might be time to question with your coaching staff and maybe get some physio and get some downtime sorted out, just because if you catch it early, it's better to take 1 week off now than keep at it, especially when the season should, well, theoretically the season is least relevant at the beginning, regardless. Essentially, if season allows it, take a little bit of time off now rather than keep pushing, ignoring it, and then really hurt yourself and have to take really long time off somewhere that might be more important. You never know. It's always kind of worth having a think about these things and seeing how it kind of plays up. One other thing to consider, especially if you're building your training program, is exercise selection. So we talked about how different sized people, different genders of people have slightly different recovery profiles. Some recover a bit quicker than others, some lot. Exercise selection can matter dramatically, so heavy conventional deadlifts are probably the longest thing to recover from. I mean, in the classic power lists of squat, bench, deadlift, hardest to recover from, conventional more than sumo, squat the next hardest to recover from, and then bench is last. Because bench, you're moving the bar the least amount of range, you're using the smallest muscles comparatively. Like, again, very few people have bigger pecs than they have quads. I don't think anyone does, unless you really, really, really skip leg day or are some sort of Paralympic athlete. However, what we were talking about in regards to qualification and how much recovery comes up, we're going to hit on this in part 4, which will be our SRA curves, which is that weird thing I keep doing with my finger when I do that. It looks like one of those things on a medical program where people are dying, like they have the little blip thing. Anyway, when people get very strong and shifting more weight, they need more recovery regardless of what exercise that is. So some people, again, somebody deadlifting, conventional deadlifting 180 is going to be able to train that reasonably frequently. However, somebody, comparatively, if somebody is benching 180, the recovery times are actually probably going to be the same. they're going to be very different people, but obviously the exercise is very different. So like some maybe under very new to lifting guy who's deadlifting 180 can probably train that as frequently as someone who's quite an experienced lifter who's benching 180. Their deadlift and bench training frequencies are probably going to match up reasonably closely, because you'll probably find that someone who can bench 180 is probably about as thick as the torso, as thick in their kind of chest and shoulder area, and is generally about as muscular in that area as someone who can only deadlift 180 is in their lower body extremities. And that's just training experience and qualification, pretty much, or just general mass. One last thing to touch on is when we talked about overreaching, when you're trying to push your MRV out. When you do that, we talked about you can overcook it slightly, but you usually plan ahead for that and have a deload afterwards, just in case you do. When you do that, you are going to feel really shit. And it's going to be a few of those warning signs, like you're kind of getting towards the top end limit of your training potential or your fatigue management capabilities. It also lets you know ahead of time in your training, so structuring it like that kind of gradual build-up and then a deload, you're very much aware where the hardest training is going to be. Like, you know well in advance that that week and the week preceding it, possibly, but definitely the last week, are going to be shit. So it should allow you ahead of time to really make sure that your life stuff is in order to that point. Like, you can easily plan ahead for making sure you're definitely going to be able to sleep, not booking on any nights out or anything rowdy that might affect your ability to recover. That kind of stuff is definitely not something you want to do in the midst of week 4, because that's gonna be where your hardest training is, and also possibly your most beneficial training. So again, the common argument I hear about deloads is like, oh, you're spending 1/5 of your training time not doing much. I'm like, well, technically defined by the volume of deload loading, you're spending 1/5 of your training time making sure you don't get any worse. So all you're doing is coasting. You're not getting worse, you're just coasting along. That should be your optimal deload volume. On the flip side of that, you are also spending 1/5 of your time pushing the wagon as hard as you fucking can. Like, you're pushing to really try for as much volume and or intensity or both as you can manage. Like, there's no Jurassic Park scenario. You're not wondering if you should. All you're caring about if you could. Like, you need to push the bounds of that. It will push back at some point. Like, there's no way to train long term in this game without getting injured. Like, if you have the innate desire to get better, you will overstep the line at some point and pick up little niggles and stuff. Hopefully nothing major. But with this general kind of training guideline and training format, as long as you hold yourself back from making really stupid training decisions and thinking that you can really push your MRV in a month where you're like super busy, not sleeping great, and like eating like shit because you're broke because you're trying to do loads of work and get a promotion or some shit like that. If you can objectively assess your training like that and realize that this isn't your time, this isn't your Rocky Balboa montage month, then you're fine. And then you can come back to it when you really can. It doesn't mean you can't train. You can definitely train, and you can train hard. It's just you have to have a realistic expectation of how far you can push the boat out. And with that said, I think that is us, guys. That's everything I kind of wanted to cover. Again, glad if you stuck around for all of this. There will be more videos. The next video we're going to cover is SRA curves, which are essentially those funny shapes I keep making with my fingers. We might get the whiteboard out and do some drawing. Who knows? I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Again, leave any abuse, dank memes, comments, or helpful feedback at worst down in the comment section. Like, share, subscribe, go fuck yourself. Catch you later.